When most people think of Henry VIII's children, the names that come to mind are usually the infamous Bloody Mary or the celebrated Elizabeth I. But there was another child one whose short reign cast a shadow darker than either sister's legacy. This was Edward VI, the boy who inherited the English crown at just 9 years old. Behind his fragile frame and angelic face lurked a ruler whose obsession with religious purity and absolute authority would stain the Tudor dynasty in ways his notorious father might not have imagined. What you're about to hear is not the story of a simple child king who died young. It's the tale of how power placed in the hands of a boy can twist innocence into tyranny. The year was 1537. After years of failed marriages and heartbreak, Henry VIII finally had what he longed for, a legitimate male heir. The birth of Edward was celebrated across the kingdom as the answer to England's dynastic uncertainty. Yet, the celebration was mixed with tragedy. His mother, Jane Seymour, died less than 2 weeks after childbirth, leaving the newborn prince without the one figure who might have softened his upbringing. To Henry, this child was more than a son, he was England's salvation. From his earliest days, Edward was smothered in protection, surrounded by guards, courtiers, and tutors who treated him not as a boy, but as a living symbol of divine promise. Unlike his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had endured rejection, suspicion, and even humiliation from their father Edward, was given only affection and reverence. Henry, perhaps out of guilt for his harsh treatment of his daughters, poured all his attention into his son. But this wasn't ordinary fatherly love. Edward was raised in a gilded cage, praised as chosen by God, and indoctrinated with the belief that his authority would one day be unquestionable. His tutors were no ordinary instructors. Henry selected radical Protestant scholars whose task was not merely to educate Edward, but to shape him into a weapon of religious reform. By 6 years old, Edward was reading theology alongside his lessons in Latin and Greek. He absorbed doctrines that painted Catholicism as corrupt and dangerous, and he was taught that a true Protestant king ruled with divine approval and absolute power. John Schick, Edward's primary tutor, was a gifted thinker, but also a man of extreme views. Through him, the boy learned to see the world in absolutes, purity versus corruption, God's will versus rebellion. Every lesson was framed through this lens, until Edward could articulate sophisticated arguments for why Catholics deserved punishment, and why disobedience to him was nothing less than defiance of God. What made this upbringing even more perilous was how unbalanced it was. Edward could argue like a theologian, but he had no understanding of empathy. He had never played freely with other children, never experienced the warmth of ordinary companionship. To him, people existed only as subjects sole, to be governed, judged, or punished. The combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional detachment forged a ruler who would one day prioritize ideology over human life. In 1547, at just 9 years old, Edward ascended the throne after Henry's death. The crown now rested on the head of a child who had been trained from birth to believe he was a divine instrument of God's will. England at this moment was deeply fractured. Henry's break from Rome had left the nation unstable, split between Catholics, moderate Protestants, and zealous reformers. Edward's Regency Council, headed by his uncle Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, initially seemed to offer balance and moderation. But the true danger lay not in the council, but in the boy they were serving, an impressionable king, molded into believing that compromise was weakness and purity demanded severity. The story of Edward VI is not merely one of a sickly boy who died too young. It is the chilling reminder that power, when handed to a child raised on absolutism, can become more dangerous than any battlefield. His reign, brief though it was, revealed how fragile England truly was, and how the shadow of fanaticism would haunt the Tudor legacy long after his death. King had his own ideas about how England should be ruled from his very first council meetings. Edward demonstrated an unsettling combination of childish petulance and cold calculation, interrupting experienced advisors to lecture them about Protestant doctrine. What struck contemporary observers was how quickly the 9-year-old king began asserting his authority. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward was personally reviewing death sentences and showing disturbing enthusiasm for executions of those he deemed heretical. Court records from this period reveal a child who treated matters of life and death like intellectual exercises, debating the theological justifications for various punishments with the same detachment he might discuss Latin grammar. Witnesses reported that Edward would often smile when signing death warrants, apparently pleased with his own cleverness in finding scriptural justification for each execution. The boy king's early months were marked by what courtiers privately called religious tantrums, explosive fits of rage whenever anyone suggested moderation in religious policy. Edward had absorbed his tutor's lessons so completely that he genuinely believed any compromise with Catholic practices was a personal betrayal of Christ. When his advisor suggested allowing some Catholic nobles to continue private worship, Edward reportedly threw his inkwell at the man and screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. These incidents were initially dismissed as childish behavior, but they actually revealed the forming of a genuinely dangerous religious fanatic. Perhaps most disturbing was Edward's apparent lack of normal childish interests. While other 9-year-olds played with toys, Edward spent his free time reading accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and taking detailed notes on interrogation techniques. His personal servants reported finding drawings in his chamber depicting various torture methods, annotated with Edward's commentary on their effectiveness for extracting confessions from heretics. The boy, who should have been learning to ride horses, was instead studying the most efficient ways to break human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant vision. What made Edward particularly dangerous was his combination of religious fanaticism and royal authority. While his advisors plotted and schemed around him, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with terrifying enthusiasm. He kept detailed journals of his reign, and these documents reveal a child who delighted in descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he deemed heretics. By age 10, Edward was personally composing sermons that were delivered in churches across England, sermons that called for the complete elimination of Catholic influence and promised divine punishment for anyone who showed mercy to heretics. The young king's cruelty wasn't limited to religious matters. Edward demonstrated a vindictive streak that shocked even hardened courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When servants displeased him, Edward would devise elaborate punishments that seemed designed more to humiliate than to correct behavior. One unfortunate page who spilled wine on Edward's papers was forced to stand in the courtyard for hours, while courtiers threw rotten food at him, all at the specific direction of the 11-year-old king. Edward watched these humiliations with obvious pleasure, often taking notes on the victims' reactions, as if conducting scientific experiments. The boy king's journal entries from this period reveal a mind that was becoming increasingly detached from normal human emotion. Edward wrote about the sufferings of others with the same clinical detachment he used to describe the weather, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on Edward's orders for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, the young king's only recorded comment was to note that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in removing the subject from further error. Edward's treatment of his own family provided perhaps the clearest indication of his growing sociopathy. Despite being raised alongside his sisters during early childhood, Edward showed no natural affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he assumed the throne. Instead, he viewed them through the same religious lens he applied to all his subjects. Mary was a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or eliminated, while Elizabeth was a potential ally whose Protestant sympathies made her marginally more acceptable. Family relationships for Edward were purely political calculations. The transformation became even more apparent when Edward's uncle Thomas Seymour attempted to gain influence over him through gifts and flattery rather than being swayed by kindness. Edward saw Thomas's overtures as attempts to manipulate him and responded with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, Edward not only supported his execution but reportedly watched from his window as the man who had once been kind to him was dragged to the scaffold. Witnesses reported that the boy king showed no emotion as the axe fell, instead making notes in his journal about the effectiveness of different execution methods. As Edward entered his 12th year, his authoritarian tendencies intensified dramatically. The boy who had once seemed frail and bookish began asserting direct control over government policy, often overruling his advisors when he felt they were being too lenient. His Protestant reforms became increasingly draconian, with mandatory church attendance enforced by networks of informants and severe penalties for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward personally designed a system of religious surveillance that would have made the First Spanish Inquisition proud, with neighbors encouraged to spy on neighbors and children rewarded for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. The king's obsession with control extended to every aspect of English religious life. Edward issued detailed regulations governing not just public worship, but private devotions, dictating exactly how his subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. Violation of these regulations was treated as treason against both crown and deity, with punishments that escalated from public humiliation to imprisonment to death. The boy king personally reviewed every case, often increasing the recommended punishments because he felt the original sentences showed insufficient zeal for Protestant purity. Edward established what were essentially thought police, encouraging subjects to report on their neighbors' religious practices with rewards for successful denunciations. The young king took personal pleasure in reading these reports, often summoning the accusers to court to provide additional details about their neighbors' supposed transgressions. Those found guilty of Catholic sympathies faced imprisonment, torture, or death, with the young king personally reviewing and often increasing the recommended punishments. Edward's court became a place where paranoia and fanaticism were rewarded, and mercy was seen as weakness. The machinery of persecution that Edward created was remarkable for its systematic nature and the king's personal involvement in its operation. Unlike adult rulers, who might delegate such matters to subordinates, Edward insisted on reviewing every case personally, studying the details of each accused person's alleged crimes, and often devising specific punishments tailored to what he saw as their particular theological errors. His journals from this period read like manuals for religious persecution, filled with detailed discussions of which punishments were most effective for different types of heresy. What made Edward's persecution particularly chilling was how he combined childish creativity with deadly serious intent. When traditional punishment seemed insufficient, the teenage king would invent new forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by elaborate theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced to carry a sign reading, "Enemy of Christ," through the streets of London, while children threw stones at him, all at Edward's specific direction. The king watched this spectacle from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's suffering while dictating observations to his secretary. The king's obsession with religious purity extended to his own family in ways that revealed his complete lack of natural affection. Edward viewed his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as family but as the greatest threat to his Protestant England. In private letters that survived, Edward wrote about Mary with a hatred that was Protestant England. In private letters that survived, Edward wrote about Mary with a hatred that was both childish and chilling, referring to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy while plotting ways to have her declared illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy, who should have felt brotherly affection, instead harbored fantasies of seeing his sister burn at the stake for her religious beliefs. Edward's hatred of Mary went beyond mere political calculation. It seemed to consume him with a personal intensity that worried even his most radical advisors. The young king spent hours devising scenarios where he could legally eliminate Mary from the succession, consulting with Protestant lawyers, who were all too willing to find legal justifications for what amounted to fratricide. Court observers noted that Edward's mood would darken whenever Mary's name was mentioned, and he would often retreat to his chambers to write long screeds about the theological necessity of removing her from the line of succession. The boy king's plans for dealing with Mary became increasingly elaborate and cruel. Edward drafted detailed scenarios for Mary's arrest, trial, and execution, complete with specific charges of heresy and treason. He even wrote what he intended to be Mary's confession, forcing her to renounce Catholicism and acknowledge her illegitimate birth before being granted the mercy of a quick death by beheading rather than burning. These documents, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind that had moved far beyond normal political rivalry into genuine sociopathic hatred. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complex but equally disturbing. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he viewed his younger sister primarily as a useful tool for his religious agenda, rather than his family. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a way to cement Protestant alliances, treating her future happiness as irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage might bring to his cause. Even his relatively positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions, making it clear that his sister's value to him was purely instrumental. The king's inability to form normal family relationships extended to his broader court as well. Edward treated his nobles, advisors, and servants not as individuals with their own worth, but as pieces on a chessboard, to be moved according to his religious and political strategies. Those who served him faithfully for years could find themselves discarded or even executed if they showed insufficient enthusiasm for his increasingly extreme policies. Loyalty to Edward meant complete submission to his vision of Protestant England, with no room for personal conscience or moral qualms. When Edward began showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior became even more erratic and cruel. Rather than softening in the face of mortality, the 15-year-old king became obsessed with ensuring that his Protestant reforms would survive his death. He knew that Mary's accession would mean the restoration of Catholicism, and this knowledge drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The possibility of his life's work being undone by his Catholic sister filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness, leading him to contemplate solutions that would have horrified even his tyrannical father. The young king's declining health seemed to intensify rather than moderate his extremism. As Edward grew weaker physically, his religious fervor burned even brighter, as if he were trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Court physicians reported that the king's illness was accompanied by periods of fevered preaching, during which he would deliver rambling sermons about the need to eliminate Catholic influence, even if it meant killing every Catholic in England. These rants were initially dismissed as delirium, but Edward's lucid moments revealed that his extreme statements reflected genuine intentions. Rather than sickness-induced ravings, Edward began secretly meeting with Protestant extremists, plotting a coup that would bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty, involving plans to arrest or kill both of his sisters and install a puppet regime controlled by Protestant fanatics. The 15-year-old king, despite his physical weakness, threw himself into these planning sessions with an energy that amazed and frightened his co-conspirators. The details of Edward's final plot revealed the full extent of his transformation from innocent child to would-be tyrant. Working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northland, Edward crafted a plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both his sisters and the installation of a Protestant regime more extreme than anything England had ever seen. The conspiracy included provisions for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the seizure of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both detailed and enthusiastic. The dying king spent his final weeks drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant paradise, his handwriting increasingly shaky due to his illness filled page after page with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. The boy, who had once seemed like an innocent victim of political manipulation, revealed himself to be the driving force behind a conspiracy that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look merciful by comparison. But Edward's illness had a cruel twist that seemed almost like divine retribution for his planned atrocities. Modern medical analysis suggests that the young king suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and what was likely arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own physicians in a misguided attempt to treat his condition. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned by the very people trying to save his life. As the poisons slowly destroyed his body, Edward experienced hallucinations and periods of madness that were interpreted by his courtiers as religious visions. The boy who had shown no mercy to others spent his final weeks in agony, his body racked with pain as he slowly wasted away. Court physicians noted that Edward's suffering seemed to intensify his religious fervor rather than providing any spiritual comfort, as if his physical torment was feeding his mental obsessions rather than purifying them. The manner of Edward's death was particularly horrifying for those who witnessed it. Court physicians recorded that the young king's body began to emit a foul odor weeks before his death, and his skin took on a greenish tint that suggested severe poisoning. Edward's hair and fingernails began falling out, and he suffered from violent convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed. The boy who had once been considered one of the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children became a grotesque shadow of his former self, his body seemingly rebelling against the poison that was killing him. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the king remained lucid enough to understand what was happening to him, spending his final days alternating between screams of physical agony and fevered rants about Protestant martyrs. Edward's last coherent conversations were not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about his regret that he wouldn't live to complete his planned purification of England. The dying king begged his conspirators to proceed with their plot, even without him promising them that God would reward their faithfulness. In establishing his Protestant paradise, the young king's final hours were a grotesque parody of a deathbed scene. Instead of seeking forgiveness or expressing love for his family, Edward spent his last breath cursing his Catholic sister and praying for God to preserve Protestant England from what he called Mary's wickedness. Witnesses reported that his final words were not of peace, but of hatred, a fitting end to a life that had been consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism. When Edward finally died on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was palpable, though few did express it openly. The boy king who had promised to be England's salvation had instead become its nightmare, and his death offered the only escape from increasingly extreme policies that were driving the kingdom toward civil war. Even his most devoted supporters privately acknowledged that Edward's death might have been a mercy for England, though they would never have admitted such thoughts publicly. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed how completely his carefully laid plans had been built on the foundation of his personal authority. Without the king's driving will be behind the conspiracy, it collapsed within days, as moderate Protestants abandoned what they now recognized as an extremist plot. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's coup, found herself virtually friendless as nobles who had seemed committed to the Protestant cause suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Mary's successful claim to the throne was supported not just by Catholics, but by moderate Protestants, who were horrified by what Edward's reign had revealed about the potential for religious extremism. The boy king who had dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant champion had instead ensured that his reign would be remembered primarily for its cruelty, and the relief that followed his death. Even committed Protestants found themselves welcoming Catholic Mary as a preferable alternative to the continued rule of Protestant Extremists, the irony of Edward's story extends far beyond his failed succession plans. The young king, who had been so obsessed with eliminating Catholic influence, actually strengthened it through his extremism. His persecution of moderate voices within the Protestant movement had left English Protestantism dominated by fanatics who repelled ordinary believers rather than attracting them. By the time of his death, many English Protestants were beginning to view Catholicism as a refuge from the increasingly harsh demands of Edward's version of Reformed religion. Modern historians have begun to reevaluate Edward VII's reign, and the picture that emerges as far darker than the traditional narrative of a sickly boy manipulated by ambitious advisors. Court records and private correspondence reveal a young man who was genuinely enthusiastic about persecution and showed disturbing signs of enjoying others' suffering. Edward's personal involvement in planning executions and his detailed journals documenting torture methods suggests that England was ruled for 6 years by what can only be described as a child psychopath with unlimited power. The transformation of Edward from innocent child to cruel tyrant offers disturbing insights into the corrupting nature of absolute power. Unlike adult rulers who might at least retain some capacity for empathy or political calculation, Edward's complete isolation from normal human relationships and his total belief in his own divine authority created a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never been told no and who believed that opposition to his will was literally sinful became capable of atrocities that shocked even the violent Tudor age. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward's courtiers were increasingly frightened by their young king's behavior, but felt powerless to restrain him. The same divine right doctrine that justified his rule also made any opposition to his will tantamount to blasphemy, leaving even his closest advisors unable to moderate his increasingly extreme policies. The boy king had created a system where his slightest whim became law, and his growing taste for cruelty had no check except death itself. Perhaps most chilling of all is the question of what might have happened if Edward had lived to reach full adulthood. His plans for Protestant England included the establishment of a permanent religious police force, the complete elimination of Catholic nobility, and the creation of a surveillance state that would have monitored every aspect of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these policies on a small scale, and there is every reason to believe that a mature Edward VI would have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. The legacy of Edward VI serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that good intentions can be corrupted by unlimited power and religious fanaticism. The boy king, who believed he was saving England's soul, nearly destroyed its body, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his reign could have offered his subjects. His story stands as a warning about the dangers of combining absolute authority with ideological certainty, especially in the hands of someone too young to understand the full consequences of their actions. Edward's story also illuminates the dangerous intersection of youth, power, and ideology. While adult tyrants might be restrained by political calculation or personal relationships, Edward's complete isolation and absolute belief in his own righteousness made he was capable of imagining cruelties that even seasoned statesmen found disturbing. While other children his age might have played with wooden soldiers, Edward VI was sketching out plans for executions, purges, and punishments. Human lives reduced to tokens in his relentless pursuit of religious perfection. His reign reveals with chilling clarity how education, when stripped of compassion and balance, can become a form of indoctrination. The boy was molded into a brilliant debater, but also into something far more dangerous, a ruler who could justify brutality with eloquence, yet had never learned the simple lessons of mercy or empathy. Edward's story is less about childhood, innocence, and more about how easily that innocence can be corrupted when wrapped in the language of divine destiny. His tutors, determined to shape a perfect Protestant sovereign, instead helped create a boy who saw cruelty not as evil, but as duty. child convinced that violence was righteous when committed in the name of faith. In the end, Edward VI's short reign became one of history's most unsettling examples of power-twisting youth into tyranny. The little prince, once celebrated as Henry VIII's miracle heir, transformed into a figure whose death was not mourned but quietly welcomed by many of his subjects. His evolution from cherished child to feared young monarch forces us to confront harsh truths about human nature and about the particular danger of those who believe their harshness is holy. Edward's passing at only 15 years old closed not only a life, but also the possibility of a far darker English future. His final days, racked with pain and consumed by suspicion, mirrored the reign itself, a chapter marked by fear, intolerance, and unfulfilled promise. Yet in dying young, the boy king may have unintentionally rendered his greatest service to his kingdom by cutting short the full flowering of his zealotry. England was spared the horrors that might have unfolded had his vision of absolute religious purity been allowed to mature.